Think you know everything about Henry VIII? You know, the king with 6 wives who simply changed England's history? Well, prepare yourself because the real Henry was far more monstrous than history books dare to write. He wasn't just a chubby monarch, he was so grotesquely obese he could barely move without mechanical aids. A man whose festering leg wounds stank so foully that servants literally ran away, clutching their noses. A ruler whose coffin, well, you'll find out soon enough. You are about to learn such shocking details from his life that they will make Game of Thrones look like a children's story. From his bizarre eating rituals to paranoid security measures, from his cruel treatment of wives that went far beyond mere execution to the terrifying truth about his final years. These are the facts that will change everything you thought you knew about one of England's most famous kings. Let's get straight to the most shocking truth about Henry VIII. By the end of his life, he was literally a walking, decaying corpse. His body had become so repulsive that even his own servants were traumatized. Imagine this, a waistline of 54 inches. That's bigger than the height of many people. His weight approached 400 pounds, while the average man at the time weighed around 140. But the most horrifying part wasn't just the obesity. His legs were covered in constantly oozing non-healing ulcers. We're not talking about small sores. We're talking about gigantic pus-seeping wounds from which fluid continuously drained and chunks of flesh fell off. The stench was so unbearable that courtiers held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when they approached the king. Some accounts describe the smell as being detectable from adjacent rooms. Servants would draw lots to decide who had to help him dress, as approaching the wounds was considered a punishment. But wait, it gets worse. Modern doctors believe that in 1536, Henry suffered a severe traumatic brain injury during a jousting accident. He was unconscious for 2 hours, which by the standards of the time was near fatal. This injury likely caused the massive shifts in his personality, explaining why he went from a relatively normal young king to a paranoid, rage-filled monster. What history lessons don't tell you is that Henry probably suffered from Cushing syndrome, which explains his rapid weight gain, severe mood swings, and those horrific ulcers that wouldn't heal. His personal doctors were so terrified they didn't dare hint at his serious illness. Criticizing a monarch's health was treason. The man who claimed to rule by divine right couldn't even control his own bowels in his final years. Royal servants carried special chairs for him because Henry could barely walk from one room to another without an accident. And this is the same man who executed people for a single wrong look. Everyone knows Henry VIII had 6 wives and that he had 2 of them executed, but the reality of what these women endured goes far beyond a simple execution. We're talking about psychological torture that would make modern serial killers blush. Take Anne Boleyn, for instance. Before he executed her, Henry didn't just pass sentence. He orchestrated an elaborate setup that included torturing her personal musician to get him to confess to an affair with her. But here's the truly horrific part. Henry made Anne watch as 5 men, including her own brother, were executed for their supposed affairs with her. She had to stand there knowing she was next, watching innocent people die because of her husband's paranoid fantasies. Catherine Howard was even less fortunate. She was essentially a teenager when Henry married her, and when he discovered her past relationships, he didn't just execute her. He passed a law that made it treason for anyone to marry a monarch without revealing their sexual history. Imagine being so petty that you change the entire legal system of a country because your young wife wasn't a virgin. But the mind games were the most terrifying part. Henry could shower his wives with gifts and love one day and the next completely ignore them or threaten them. Catherine of Aragon spent her final years under house arrest, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary, while Henry spread rumors that she was insane. She died alone, possibly poisoned, sending Henry letters he never even bothered to read. And here's what will truly shock you. Henry forced his wives to sign documents confirming their own divorces or annulments. Anne of Cleves was so terrified she agreed to a fake annulment just to avoid being executed. She had to pretend their marriage never existed and thank him for not killing her. And what about Jane Seymour, who seemingly got lucky by dying naturally? She died from complications after giving birth to Henry's son. But Henry was already scouting his next wife before Jane's body was even cold. He waited exactly 9 days after her funeral to begin planning his next marriage. This man treated people like disposable objects. And the most terrifying thing is that these women had no escape. Divorce wasn't an option. Fleeing meant death, and resistance meant not only your own execution, but the potential destruction of your entire family. If you think eating contests are a little extreme, wait until you hear about Henry VIII's daily diet. This man didn't just eat like a king, he ate like he was single-handedly trying to cause a famine. Henry consumed around 5,000 calories a day. For comparison, that's more than double what an active adult male needs. And remember, by the end of his life, he could barely walk. But it wasn't just the quantity. The strangest part was what and how he ate. A typical lunch for Henry included a whole roast pig, several chickens, various types of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to fill a small boat. His kitchen staff prepared over 800 different dishes daily just for his court, and Henry himself would sample dozens of them. The royal kitchens employed more than 200 people around the clock just to satisfy his appetite. But here's where the true oddities begin. Henry was convinced that certain foods had magical properties. He believed eating swan meat would make him more graceful, consuming venison would improve his hunting skills, and oysters would increase his bedroom performance. So he gorged himself on these foods in massive quantities, like he was obsessed with some medieval superfood diet. He also had the most bizarre eating rituals. Every single bite of food that went into Henry's mouth was first tasted by several servants to check for poison. But get this, he was so paranoid he would demand his tasters wait 30 minutes after eating before he would touch his food himself, just to make sure they didn't die from a slow-acting poison. Henry's meals were like theatrical performances. He ate in front of hundreds of courtiers, and the entire process could take up to 4 hours. Imagine sitting and watching this enormous rotting king slowly consume enough food to feed a small village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal royal behavior. What they don't teach you in history class is that Henry even banned certain foods from his court, not because they were unhealthy, but because he deemed them beneath his royal status. Common foods like turnips and barley were literally off the menu, even though they would have likely been far better for his health than the mountains of meat and sugar he consumed daily. The craziest part, even as his body was literally falling apart from his diet, Henry ate more and more, convinced that his royal status somehow made him immune to the consequences of his own gluttony. Henry VIII's paranoia wasn't just don't trust anyone. The man turned his kingdom into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators jealous. By his final years, Henry was so convinced everyone was out to get him that he turned court life into a living nightmare for everyone around him. Let's start with his sleeping habits. He slept with loaded crossbows next to his bed and kept several daggers under his pillow. But that wasn't enough. He also kept armed guards right in his bedroom to watch him while he slept all night. Imagine being so afraid of assassination that you can't even close your eyes without a witness. The palace itself became a fortress of paranoia. Henry ordered secret passageways built throughout all the buildings he lived in, not for romance or convenience, but so he could escape if assassins came. He had peepholes built into the walls so he could spy on his courtiers, and had listening devices hidden in meeting rooms to eavesdrop on private conversations. But here's where the real insanity begins. Henry created an entire network of spies whose job was to spy on other spies. He had informants watching his informants, creating this twisted web of surveillance where no one knew who they could trust. Court life became a psychological horror movie where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could lead to an immediate execution. Henry's paranoia about food reached absurd heights. Not only did he have multiple tasters, but all of his dishes had to be prepared in fully locked kitchens under the watchful eyes of guards. Salt, spices, even water, all had to be tested by different people. He was so convinced he would be poisoned that a simple meal became a military operation. He even suspected his own children of plotting against him. He hired spies to watch his daughters, Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth. His suspicions went so far that he executed people for future crimes, or because he had a dream that they would betray him. The tower was constantly filled with people whose only crime was being near Henry in one of his paranoid moods. The most terrifying thing is that Henry's paranoia was so contagious it infected his entire court. Nobles spied on each other, servants betrayed their masters for imaginary rewards, and everyone lived in constant fear that they would be the king's next victim. You probably think Henry VIII's reign of terror ended with his death, right? This man was so committed to being a disaster that even his corpse managed to cause utter chaos. Let's start with his final weeks. Henry was so massive that servants had to carry him everywhere on a specially designed chair with pulleys and wheels. And here's the most disgusting part. His leg wounds became so infected that chunks of rotting flesh would literally fall off his body as he was being carried. Servants had to follow him with rags to clean up the pieces of the decaying king that fell onto the palace floor. The scene of his death was something out of a horror movie. Henry's body had bloated to such a monstrous size that his skin was stretched and shiny. The smell was so unbearable that even his doctors, used to medieval medical horrors, had to leave the room so they wouldn't vomit. When he finally died, no one wanted to get close enough to officially confirm his death. But wait, it gets even worse. Henry's body was so filled with gas from internal decomposition that his coffin had to be specially reinforced. They wrapped his corpse in lead sheets and sealed it in multiple wooden boxes, thinking that would contain the mess. They were very, very wrong. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, something completely unbelievable happened. The coffin literally exploded. The gases from Henry's decomposing body created so much pressure that the lead lining burst and his rotting royal remains were splattered all over the inside of the hearse. The smell was so terrible that the funeral procession had to stop while servants cleaned up the mess with buckets and rags. Here's the detail that will haunt your nightmares. Reportedly, dogs licked up the remains that had leaked from his coffin onto the road. The man who claimed to rule by divine right ended up as dog food on a country lane. Even his burial was a disaster. They had to dig his grave extra wide to fit the massive coffin. But the ground kept caving in because the soil couldn't support the weight of all that lead and rotting flesh. It took several tries to finally get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there. The chaos didn't end there. For years afterward, people reported strange noises and terrible smells coming from Henry's tomb. Some claimed it was his ghost, but historians believe it was likely just gases escaping from his continuously decomposing remains. What they don't teach you in history class is that Henry's death was so traumatic for everyone involved that several of the servants who worked with his body died within weeks, possibly from infections they caught from handling his rotting corpse. There he is, the real Henry VIII. Not a legendary monarch, but a man whose body and mind destroyed him. A man so obsessed with power and his own demons that he turned the greatest power on earth into a realm of terror. His legacy isn't just about reform, but a story of how absolute power can destroy a human soul. If you thought you knew history, it might be time to look at it from a different angle. What else are they hiding from us in the textbooks?